G'day, Kellie and Team Curveball. My name is Rob, and I think our Curveball story is possibly a little bit different to many that you've heard. You see, as I'm recording this, my wife and I are sitting down to crack a bottle of champagne to celebrate a year since our successful 13-year-old business went from a $6 million turnover to zero. to $0 turnover. And actually, to top that off, we're actually currently sitting in a trailer park on the opposite side of Australia to where we started. So possibly not the indicators of success that most of your listeners would expect.
Wow. I mean, as someone who runs their own business, that really hits home. I'm Kellie Riordan, and if you're a regular Curveball listener, you've probably noticed a bit of a pattern with our guests. They're all incredible leaders who start out with a dream, usually in their garages or in their kitchens, and they work really hard. And at some point, most of them have been through the ringer. They've either seen their profits fall, their entire industry impacted by an event, or they've had their kids go through life-threatening illnesses. And they've had to put it all on the line. But through a combination of guts and strategy and resilience, they somehow bring it back from the brink. But at its core, Curveball is a podcast about incredible leaders making the right decisions under the toughest circumstances. And that's what Rob Malachy and Maureen Hortmont did. And it was one of the hardest decisions of their lives. But the results have been surprising, to say the least. Maureen and Rob are a husband and wife team, the CEO and the Chief Operating Officer, respectively, of a 13-year-old business they grew up alongside their human babies. It was a business based on international travel experiences for university students. Yep, I can hear you wincing right now. And for them, the right call was to call time. They got in touch to share their story.
Curveball is all about thriving when the chips are down. And most people probably think that means pulling off some gutsy, brazen pivot in the face of death and flying off into the sunset on the back of some unicorn with money flying out of bags hanging off the wings. But that's really selling the concept short. And a lot of people that have been in business or even just life for a long time know that sometimes there's a monstrous, demonic fire front that's bearing down on your little town and your little team in your little town. And the only thing that you can do to stay alive is to quietly and quickly make an orderly exit via stage left.
That's a voice memo that Rob sent me at hello@deadsetstudios.com, and it gets me every time, this story. Rob, Maureen, welcome to Curveball, and I'd like to start where you started, with that glass of champagne. Why on earth were you celebrating and cracking open this bottle of bubbly when you recorded that voice memo?
Well, it's one of those things. Sometimes decisions are really hard, but they're relatively simple. And as you said in your introduction, it's the right decision in the circumstance. Maureen has this expression that she loves, which is, you don't get to choose the cards you're dealt. You only get to choose how to play them. And in the situation we were faced with in March 2020, when we really sat down and went through the details, it was really obvious that there was a big fire front bearing down on our little business, and there was just no way out. And so for us, as painful and as hard as that decision was, it was the right decision. And I think you should be celebrating good decisions, no matter how difficult they were.
It's easier to celebrate with hindsight. It's been a year, and we've had the chance to see both the havoc that the pandemic has wreaked and to recover from the emotional turmoil that it caused at our end. It turns out that closing the business and then hitting the road has been a fantastic experience for our family. So whilst closing AIM Overseas was never on the cards for 2020, and if you told us that when we were celebrating the start of 2020, we would not have believed it, and would have been quite astounded or really worried at that prospect. It turns out that it's had a lot of upsides. So no, it's not what we would have wished for, but we feel like we've met a lot of a very bad situation.
Maureen, you are the CEO of AIM Overseas. And so for a few years, you've been running this very successful business with your husband, Rob. And it's when you notice early in 2020 that things are changing that you started to come to a decision. What was going on for the pair of you at the time?
Well, throughout January, when we started seeing news out of China about COVID-19, we weren't that concerned, to be honest, to start with. I think we were like a lot of people, not quite understanding what was on the horizon. The news at the time was saying, a lot of the news were like, oh, it's not so much more than a flu, and people should not panic. We'd seen the impact of other viruses like H1N1. We had students that had to quarantine back in 2009. Things hadn't been too bad from a business point of view. And to start with, we thought we were looking at a similar scenario. But as time went on in February, we started to see the virus spread through Italy and then Spain and France, and it started to get quite frightening. By the end of February, Rob was due to go to a conference in the US and was really excited to go to that conference. I was really concerned by then that things were looking very dire. I didn't want him to go. I was worried that he could stay stuck over there. And I thought that from a business point of view, we were going to have to make some really tough decisions in the coming days or week, and I wanted to have him there, but the appeal, the call of the conference was too strong, and so Rob left.
Why don't men just listen to us, Maureen?
If it's any compensation, Kellie, I'm very good afterwards at saying, you know what, I was very wrong on that, and it's astounding how often that happens. That's actually why Maureen is the CEO.
I love that both from a business perspective and the fact that she's your wife, she's like sitting here going, I really don't think you should be going to this conference, both as my husband and also as the person who is running the company with me.
That's right. I was pretty anxious, but hey, once it's done, it's done. You just have to go with it.
So was Rob still overseas when you were having that real moment of realization? Because you're dealing with international students, and I imagine that travel insurance now is becoming an issue.
Correct. So by then it's late February, early March. Rob is overseas. The conference is unfolding, and the numbers in Italy are rising. I'm starting to think the World Health Organization hadn't yet declared this a pandemic, yet it really looked like it was going that way. And I was thinking, okay, students aren't going to be able to get travel insurance even if they are able to travel overseas. We can't take the risk of sending them overseas and potentially have one get very gravely sick and gravely ill in hospital without a travel insurance. And so despite the borders still being open at that stage, I was thinking this is starting to look very improbable that we can send anyone anywhere. Rob was due to come back home it was Friday the 6th of March, and in the couple of days prior to that, I was having conversations with my brother overseas, who's very good in business and has often helped us on really tough decisions. He was still remaining very optimistic, thinking it was very improbable that borders would close and so on. I thought that was bound to happen, and I didn't think that the borders would necessarily close. That I didn't envisage, but I thought that the universities would stop their students from going because they would be concerned about the risks. And that indeed happened. We started receiving emails from the Australian universities saying we will not let our students go and travel overseas this coming July, which is when we were running university programs overseas. It was only a handful of universities to start with. We're talking about 2 or 3. But once you've got a couple that start to make that decision, you know that it's not going to take very long before the others head down that road. And so by the time Rob flew in from the US on the 6th of March, said to him, we've got to sit down and we've got to look at numbers and we've got to make some decisions because I don't think July is happening.
I mean, this is interesting. Rob's away at this, motivational retreat, essentially, and you're starting to field those calls from the universities and having to make some difficult decisions. So once Rob lands, Rob, can you tell me what kind of mindset you were in at that point, having flown on what I imagine is one of the last international flights back from the US into Australia? How quickly could you catch up with Marine, who is essentially, it's like she's got a crystal ball. She's 2 weeks ahead of everybody at this point.
Yeah. I flew back in from that conference, and while I'd been there, it was a social media marketing conference, so really cutting edge, exciting, and lots of cool stuff going on, as you say. And I flew in, and we'd been talking throughout that week, and I was sort of thinking to myself, oh, look, Marine's really worried about this bug thing going around, but we've seen it before. Honest story, when swine flu happened, about 3 weeks after that broke in Mexico, Marina and I got on a plane and flew to Mexico because we had it all booked. So I kind of was like leaning into that previous experience. And I've also read all of those classic books like The Lean Startup and The Hard Thing About Hard Things, where businesses get smacked in the face with something massive and then turn around and everything is all right and you save the day with some heroic action. And so I guess I was in that mindset, like, yeah, it's kind of getting bad out there, but there's options for us. We'll find some way through it. And I flew in 6:30 in the morning, flight in, the red eye from LA. Marine and I go to have a coffee at the coffee shop. And I mean, paraphrasing here, but Marine pretty much kind of looked at me and said something to the effect of, it's done. And we then... And I was thinking, no, it'll be fine. There's some way through it. We'll work this out. And I'm still thinking at this point that it's all a little bit overblown. But then we started stepping through the reality of what it meant for our business. It was a biannual cycle business, so 2 peak periods a year where you make all of your money. And we were really looking at the fact that we would have 0 students for July. Marine said, very rightly, that once July was closed, once universities ruled out that risk, they wouldn't want to re-accept that risk for some time, which meant probably our January intake was about to disappear as well. And we just did the sums on essentially the back of a napkin and went, oh yeah, actually, this is a game changer. There's no way out of this.
Because what you've got to consider, Kelly, is when we're talking about January, it's not that we were considering that things would be like they are, like they were this January. We had no idea. But for us, in terms of the way our business worked, it meant that we would have to start advertising our programs, setting them up, recruiting students from May. And we're early March, and we're looking at universities saying we're not letting students go in July. This is looking really dire. This is going to take a while to get better. And so for us, we were closing applications for all those programs by September for a January intake. It was very obvious very quickly that we weren't going to have the lead time, and financially we weren't going to be able to cope. So then we're starting to make calculations. What if we drop programs? What if we only retain a handful of programs? What if we retain a handful of staff? What if we move the office back home and try to work from our living room? So we started doing all sorts of calculations to see what was potentially feasible and at what cost. But what came into the equation as well was the fact that we already had to reimburse all the students who had applied for that coming July. So we already had about $600,000 worth of fees to reimburse to students. And then we would have to pay all of our staff as well. And any money that had come into our business really since November was money that was kind of spent already, so to speak. So it was meant to be for that July intake that was not going to materialize.
Who made the final call, and were you in agreement when you made it?
We were in agreement when we made it. I voiced it, and Rob very much agreed. That in that sense, it was an easy decision because whilst it was a hard decision from an emotional point of view, it was an easy decision from a practical standpoint in terms of looking at numbers and being in agreement.
It's one of those things, Kelly. I mean, you don't get to choose the card you're dealt. And when we were looking at it, we realised that the choice we were facing wasn't, could we save this business? It was, could we do the right thing by everybody? Could we move fast enough so that we would reimburse every student that had paid money to us? $600,000 we reimbursed in 3 days. As a counterpoint, some of the biggest companies in our space, STA Travel, Antipodeans Abroad, big companies doing millions and millions of dollars of business, left students thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars out of pocket when they went under. And we moved really quickly to make sure we could reimburse that, refund our staff, pay out our staff everything that they were due, and help them as much as we could to get new jobs, because we felt that there was a recession coming. And that was the decision that we were facing. It wasn't a could we save this decision.
And I imagine, even just the paperwork to wrap up a 13-year-old business in such a short space of time, was that really incredibly difficult logistically?
What was interesting was there was a few interesting things logistically. Not only was there all the students to reimburse, and that was a fair bit of work, but also we actually had to vacate our office, because the lucky thing was we were about to move into a new office, and we should have signed a new lease to move into a slightly bigger, more modern office. Thankfully, things had been quite slow from our real estate agent point of view, so that by the time that he kind of woke up and said, "Hey, we're ready to sign for that new lease," we said, "Oh, well, we're not anymore." So thankfully, we didn't commit to that 5-year lease, but it meant that we had to vacate the office in the middle of the lockdown. And Rob had to pretty much do that on his own. I was by then stuck at home with our 2 daughters doing the homeschooling.
Of course. So you've got 2 young girls. You're wrapping up your business. Mm-hmm. This is putting, I imagine, enormous pressure on your marriage, your personal finances, and then you have to go home and homeschool the kids.
That's right. Lots of joy, like many people experienced in Australia and around the world, right?
You also had the benefit of learning to run a business, or certainly step through some really challenging decisions by watching your brother and your father and your brother-in-law. Can you tell us about sort of your early journey into running a business?
Sure. Growing up in France, I saw my father start a business when he was in his 50s, and I saw the challenges associated with that, especially in France, where the requirements are quite stringent and there's a lot of taxations implied. And I saw him do it alone with a partner actually in Australia. And I could see both the excitement that it provided and also how tough it was. At the same time, my brother, who is 14 years older, left home when I was 8 and flew to the States, to the Silicon Valley, to start his own business in software, and did incredibly well, and was extremely inspiring in terms of the stories that he had. And then I saw my brother-in-law working as an independent in France, working very hard and doing something that he was really passionate about, but that was certainly very tough as well. Seeing all those various experiences was, I guess, what somewhat inspired me, and also maybe surprisingly didn't deter me, because it's very tough. But I guess until you're really thrown in it and you experience it yourself, you don't realize quite how tough it is. I think it's more inspiring than obvious, that the difficulties that other people encounter. And I think that's where Rob and I have been very lucky to start this business together. It's been wonderful to be able to share this journey. It doesn't mean it hasn't been tough, and we've definitely had our fair share of arguments along the way, but certainly to have someone else that understands the pressure and the stresses of starting a business has been hugely helpful. And to me, it was something that I always wanted to do. I'm fiercely independent. I couldn't quite see myself working for someone else. I wanted to do something that would make a difference in the world in some way. And I think we've very much achieved that together.
You certainly have done that. It's an incredible story. Of course, by the time you move to Australia, it's as an international student, and you meet Rob at a party. So, Rob, what do you remember of that time when you first met Maureen?
Well, if you can picture it, it was just your typical university party in a house, a bunch of grotty students just hanging out, drinking beers. And I remember walking into this house party being run by a couple of mutual German friends, and I knew most people there, and there in the corner in a beanbag or sitting on a chair was this gorgeous French girl. And so that was my first impression. I was like, wow, she's really cute. And I haven't seen her before. And it's funny because Maureen doesn't really remember me from that party, but I certainly remember her.
And
he made an impression at the next party.
as you would when you know that there's a next date that you're wanting to secure. So really early on you start dating, but there is a curveball that hits your relationship quite early on when Rob decides to sort of up and leave you behind, Maureen. What happened there?
Well, he had planned an overseas trip. He'd planned to go overseas and travel the world for a year. He'd planned it before we met, and so, of course, went ahead and did it, which, of course, from a relationship standpoint was not easy. I was not exactly thrilled to see my new boyfriend disappear overseas, especially back in 2001. Communications were a lot harder when you were overseas. You had to buy those, expensive $20 phone cards that would only work for a certain amount of time, and you had to dial in 15 different numbers hoping that the person at the other end would pick up the phone. So it was a bit harder to talk. But in saying that, it was actually really good that he did that. It meant that he had the trip that he planned, and it also meant that I had an experience of Australia that I wouldn't have had if we'd met and if we'd stayed in Australia as soon as we met and gotten together. It was good that I was really out of my comfort zone, meeting lots of new people and having lots of experiences here, working on my English and traveling and everything, which I wouldn't have done if it stayed. So I think it was really good for both of us. And let's be honest, we actually did manage to meet up in the middle a couple of times.
Just to continue the story, we probably wouldn't have gotten together if I didn't have that trip planned. I'd met Maureen. I really liked her. I'd kind of implied as much to her that I was really keen on her. And to start with, she knocked me back. And I remember going home after she knocked me back and thinking to myself, I'm such a jerk. Here I am. I'm about to bugger off on this great trip around the world for a year. What would be the point in getting a girlfriend, getting her maybe excited about having a relationship if in 1 month I'm going to be disappearing for you? That's a really slack thing to do. So I basically wrote her a letter and I said, I think you're really great. I'm really sorry I hit on you. It was unfair because I'm doing this trip anyway. I'd really like to just be friends with you. And funnily enough, that kind of got Maureen's attention and she went, oh, he's actually a decent bloke. And so the next time we went out together, it turned into something that I wasn't expecting because I'd already been knocked back. So thank God I had that trip planned because we wouldn't be sitting here in a caravan park in Exmouth having just dived with whale sharks. This whole adventure wouldn't have happened if it weren't for that first trip and that year apart that we had.
Once you came back, Rob, how did you both come up with the idea for AIM Overseas? What was the genesis of the business?
That's a good question. We both started our careers. My early career was in the university sector. Maureen also was in higher education. We both worked at Macquarie University for some time. Then Maureen went into work doing inbound international student recruitment. So that's what a lot of people would recognise as the business side of international higher education, bringing international students into Australia where they pay fees. I was on the other side of the coin. I was working inside the university running the outbound exchange programs, which at the time was very much seen as the benevolent side of universities, sending students out and giving them nice, warm and fuzzy experiences was kind of the way it was looked at. But together we looked at it and we went, hang on a second, this business, this international student movement business exists everywhere else in the world, but it doesn't exist here in Australia sending students out. Plenty of businesses bringing students in, nobody sending students out. And once again, Maureen, given that entrepreneurial background and that desire to run a business, was really the one that said, you know what, we shouldn't be doing this for anyone else. We should do this for ourselves. And it was the year that we got married, 2007. We started working on a business plan and then we decided that it was time to step out and start this thing for ourselves.
the great thing is when you don't know what you don't know, right? There was so much we didn't know. We probably weren't scared enough. And I think it was a great time for us to start a business. We didn't have the responsibility of having kids. We felt like we didn't have that much to lose. And so we went for it, even though we didn't have that much going for it, to be honest.
From Dead Set Studios, this is Curveball. We'll have more of Maureen and Rob's story in just a tick. From Dead Set Studios, this is Curveball, the podcast where we talk to leaders who thrive when the chips are down. And today it's a not-so-typical episode. I'm with Marie Hortmont and Rob Malicki, the Chief Operating Officer and the CEO of AIM Overseas. It's an organisation that was started up around international student travel. So, of course, in early 2020, that looked very, very shaky, and the pair made a heartbreaking decision to close the doors on a business that they'd been running together for 13 years. Rob, I'm wondering if you can tell me about starting out in life together, getting married, but you're also starting a business at the same time. Was that tough in those early days to manage the partnership, both from the business perspective and being married?
I don't think so. For us, it was quite a natural thing. And the thing that I love about the whole business journey together is that your whole life becomes holistic. Everything is melded together. So you work together, you live together, you make decisions together. You really control everything all at once. It's not like you're beholden to run off to another place and somebody's getting sucked in one direction and somebody's getting sucked in another. So because we didn't know what we were getting into, I think it didn't, in those early days, it wasn't too bad.
To add some perspective to that, we weren't actually spending that much time together. We were sharing our second bedroom and one big desk as our entire office. But a lot of the time, Rob was actually working away from home. We desperately needed money to come in. And so he was doing quite a bit of consulting to universities so that we weren't actually spending that many hours together.
And what about when things progressed and the business was starting to build and you had your first child? Did that change the dynamic of the way you were running the business?
Yeah, that definitely changed the game. Up until that point, we were still fairly small. I believe at the time we were probably 3 or 4 or 5 staff members. It was still a relatively small team when Maureen had to step out to take that first maternity leave. Maureen, what do you think that time was like?
That was tough. We had our daughter and Rob was back in the office a day after I came back from hospital. He was back in the office working part-time for a week, which was the very exciting thing that he was only part-time for that 1 week. And it happened that our daughter had silent reflux and was actually really unwell and screaming a lot for the first few months of her life as well. So we had a baby that never slept and screamed a lot. That plus the business and the hours that it represented in terms of trying to keep it going. It was not at a stage where we could rest on our laurels whatsoever. It needed a lot of attention. So it certainly put a lot of pressure on us.
One of the things that I don't think people from the outside of a business see is the dynamics between the two co-founders. And in this case, I brought to the kind of equation, if you like. Maureen has the business brain, had the experience doing the business of international education. I brought the network and the knowledge of the outbound mobility side of things. And so I was already really well known inside the universities in this space. And I also do stuff on YouTube and I'm very out there. I go to the conferences, et cetera, et cetera. So most people see me as the person running the business, even though it's always been a team and Maureen has made all of the biggest decisions that the company ever made. But almost every time, including friends, family, would say, "Oh, how's the business going, Rob?" but not pose any questions to Maureen. And I think it's a really difficult thing when one half of an even team, an equal team, doesn't get the recognition that the other side does.
what played into that as well was the fact that we made the decision early on that I would only be working 3 days a week because I don't have any family here, and Rob was working more than full time. We needed someone to be taking care of our daughter and running everything on the home front. And the reality is someone's got to do it. And don't get me wrong, I was super happy to spend the time with our daughter. It doesn't mean that I was any less involved in the business or cared any less. I was still very much part of all the crucial decisions, but I was putting in less hours and I was less visible. And so that certainly also played a part in terms of people's perception of what my contribution might be.
Psychologically, this is a really difficult moment for a lot of women in their career. You know, you've got yourself to a certain point in your 30s and 40s. You're actually at the peak of your earning potential. You're suddenly getting the good jobs. You know, you're in this amazing position running your own company. So it's difficult at the best of times to take what can be perceived as a sideways step or a backwards step. But while this is happening in your own company and it's your own husband who not only doesn't have to pace the floor with the screaming child as much as you, but is also getting the sort of public kudos for the running of the business, as you mentioned. Can you just give me a little bit of a sense of what that meant for you, Maureen, and what you would reflect back on about that time now?
I found it tough. I found it very tough personally, and there were moments of certainly frustration. Not that I certainly necessarily had an answer to it, or that I would have done things differently looking back, because I wanted the time with our elder daughter and then with the second one when she came along. One thing I did find frustrating was when, you read those magazines where you've got those spreads about those very successful businesswomen that seem to have it all. And to me, I feel like it's a bit contrived and not necessarily very honest. I think that you can have a lot of things, but not necessarily at the same time. I think that in any scenarios for anyone, whether you've got your own business, whether you're working in a job, whether you're a stay-at-home mum, you have to make some sort of choices and compromises. And I think life is about knowing what you want most and making some compromises and trying to live the best you can with the choices you've made, and trying to be sure that the choices you've made are the one that you want. It doesn't mean that it always comes easy. There are certainly times where I wished that things were easier on...
It's absolutely why this podcast Curveball exists, because I was a bit like you, a bit frustrated with the shiny success stories. And yes, I want to celebrate those amazing people, like Kate Morris from Adore Beauty, who floated on the stock exchange, and, she's ridden that company for 20 years, and good on her for being able to cash in. But ultimately, her story is a whole lot of hard times that we don't hear about, peppered with one or two really great moments, right? And so I think that honesty that you've got around what it really looks like within a business, even when things are going well, that it is ultimately a series of difficult and challenging moments.
It is. And of course, there's moments that you celebrate, and I guess they're the one that also maybe people hear more about. But people don't necessarily see when you're going overseas on a family holiday that you're still actually working on that family holiday, that you're taking phone calls at 11 p.m. or midnight because you've got students in all sorts of strife overseas, and that you're still getting up then at 3 a.m. to take care of your child that's just had a nightmare. There are all those stories that you just don't necessarily hear about, or the fact that you have to make some tough choices in terms of where you're going to spend the money and so on. I think it's important to hear about that as well.
That resonates so much because I, of course, have gone from, quite a stable job for the last 20 years to running my own company for the first time. And it's all the things that people don't tell you about running a business, that you will be the IT department and the one on the phone to the accountant and trying to deal with staff superannuation and,
That's right. We actually, when we started the business and we were in that second bedroom sharing the one desk and at the time the one phone, the one landline, we would take turns answering the phone. And when someone would ask for HR department or, IT department, we'd say, yes, sure. And we would just hand the phone to the other one so that it sounded like we were much bigger than we actually were.
I love that so much. You mentioned there celebrating the good times, and I want to come back to the moment of celebration of you two clinking a glass of champagne with each other in a far-flung part of regional Australia when you sent me that voice memo, because you decided to celebrate what could ultimately have looked like failure, a flop, any number of other ways you could describe a disaster, but instead you decided to reframe this moment of deciding to shut down your business in a different way. And a big part of it was the decision to jump in an RV. Tell me how you came to this decision.
Well, it's something we'd been planning to do for years. When we originally decided to open AIM overseas, the alternative to that we'd been considering at the time was a 6-month trip around South America. And instead of doing the 6-month trip, we were like, we can always travel later if we blow this business idea. And so we opened the business and, it took off and we never ended up doing that trip. So it was always something that was part of our plan, was to go traveling. And I remember about 4 or 5 years ago, Maureen came home from work. We were having a chat, and she said, I think we should do a trip around Australia. And I said, I think that's a great idea. And so we'd kind of been working on this plan to go and do a trip around Australia for some time. And I guess when we sat down to open that bottle of champagne, we were looking at what that trip would have been like had AIM Overseas still been open. And it would have been a very, very different trip. Initially, we'd only been planning to go for 6 or 7 months. But once we hit the road, we looked at each other. We weren't far in. We were probably like a month in or something like that. And we looked at each other and we said, you know what, maybe we should do 12. What are we rushing back to? We need to take this time to reset after 13 years of working every weekend and working nights and working through our holidays. Let's actually take the time. And then the other thing I think we looked at and were just amazed that we got away so cleanly. Marianne was talking about how we had this new office lease that she'd been negotiating. That, Kellie, was a $350,000 office lease that we were probably days away from signing. And so when you look at what life could have been like if things had unfolded literally just days later, a week later, I mean, personally, financially wiped out. If you look at what this trip would have been like had we had the business open, we still would have had our regular jobs, but we wouldn't have reconnected as human beings. We wouldn't have reconnected as a family the way that we have, having not had to worry about all of that stress and pressure and everything else.
We were very fortunate that we had that trip plans. It certainly made, I think, things a little bit easier in terms of trying to go past closing AIM Overseas. It did not bring back the business, but it gave us something else to focus on. And as Rob said, from a family point of view, from a couple point of view, it's been wonderful to have that time and to learn to not work all the time and to focus on other things. It has been a blessing.
I think the pandemic has given a lot of people pause for thought around what they want to do with their life. And of course, you both have been workaholics to some degree, never having a proper holiday. Can you tell me about the whiteboard exercise you did that helped you make this decision about what's next?
Yes. The whiteboard exercise was one of those things that you read about in books or you hear about on podcasts and things like that. You should sit down with a piece of paper and meditate and come up with the plan for your life. And of course, the reality is that no one got time for that. But you know what?
If one more person tells me to journal, I am going to slap them in the face.
It's so true, isn't it? The thing is, it's very, very effective though, Kellie, very, very effective. But we did actually sit down and we said, okay, well, look, we've been wiped out on this one. If we were to do something new after this, what would that ideal life for us look like if we're going to run our own business or do other things? And so we just literally worked through what our top priorities were and what were the things that we would really want in our ideal life? And that was things like both of us working no more than 4 days a week and being able to take 2 holidays a year and having time to pick the kids up and drop the kids off and time together as a couple once a week just to have a date day and things like that. And there's nothing to say that we're necessarily going to achieve all of those things when we start whatever it is we start next, but we certainly will achieve some of them. It's like that old mantra where they say you can't have everything you want, but you can have some things that you want. So you should focus on the things that you really want and go for those, knowing that some of those will come off.
What attracted me to your voice memo in the first place is you have completely reframed in your mind and therefore in reality what success is. Like, there would be other people whose businesses collapsed and yes, maybe have had a bit more financial turmoil to deal with, but who are still sitting under a doona crying about what's happened. And instead, very early on, you guys decided to go, do you know what? We had a good run. We've been able to wrap it up the way we kind of would want to given the circumstances. We're now on this amazing adventure around Australia. We've redefined what success is. This is success. You sent me a voice memo in a caravan park in a far-flung part of the country saying we view our business closing as a success story. And that's kind of like the ultimate curveball. Although I did notice on your email something at the bottom that struck me and I want to know more. It said the global society. What's the global society?
Well, the global society is another one of those points of conflict, I think, where Marine and I didn't necessarily see eye to eye on a business decision. About 6 years ago, we decided that all of the consulting work that we were doing with AIM Overseas, where we were helping universities to improve their own mobility programs, didn't really fit with AIM Overseas anymore. I mean, there's a bit of a conflict of interest where you're going into an institution telling them how to improve and at the same time you've kind of got a product to sell them. And we decided that we wanted to, I really wanted to start a new company. And that was the Global Society. And the point of the Global Society was to support universities with their own mobility programs, so not just with the programs that AIM Overseas was running. And so that company has gone through your typical business journey, multiple pivots, brink of death, 2 weeks of cash left in the bank account kind of stuff. And ironically enough, has come out the other side of COVID with an additional client to when we went in. I mean, we only have a handful of clients, but they're relatively big clients. And we picked up another one on the way through. So the company that we were literally on the verge of closing that too. I mean, when COVID happened, we asked ourselves, should we even be trying to keep that thing alive? And we're like, oh, well, I mean, it's not making any money, but it's not losing money. So what the heck, let's just leave it and see what happens. And wow, it's come out the other side. And in fact, it's got quite good upside potential because the universities have all laid off a lot of staff in this student exchange space. And when they start to ramp up again, they're not going to rehire staff. They're going to want to use technology and systems and processes and other sorts of improvements, which is exactly what the Global Society does. So that company, funnily enough, came through and actually has some relatively good prospects to thrive.
I do want to check in with Marine on this though. Marine, I mean, seriously, is he out of his mind?
Yes, it's quite typical of Rob. Anyone who knows Rob will know that he tends to take on too much. That's why it was causing tension in the first place, so that we were overextending ourselves. Felt like that we had more than enough to deal with. So I wasn't exactly thrilled about this whole Global Society thing. We did it because Rob was so damn enthusiastic about it that there was no curbing his enthusiasm and just had to go along with it. But I'm happy to say I was wrong because it looks like, 6 years on, it might actually be the thing that saves us.
Well, I really hope it does because I think if there's two people who deserve a happy ending, it's the both of you. Rob and Marine, thanks for sharing your story and also for being so honest about the roller coaster that is running a business, particularly in turbulent times. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kellie.
Thanks, Kellie.
And I'd love to hear what you guys think of Curveball. Just open whichever podcast app you're listening in right now and leave us a rating and a review. It really helps other people find the show. But you can also shoot me an email or suggest a guest. You can email it to hello@deadsetstudios.com, or you can visit our website, curveballshow.com. And make sure you're following Curveball so you always know when a brand new nugget of leadership goodness is there in your podcast feed. And that way you won't miss our next guest.
When I stand up to advocate for change, such as the paid parental leave scheme, it's not just Liz Broderick speaking. It's Liz Broderick fueled by the thousands of instances of women who have not been able to spend time with their newborns because of a financial imperative.
That's next on Curveball. You can also go back through the archives and hear how other entrepreneurs and leaders have moved from the garage to the stock exchange. Curveball's a production of Dead Set Studios, a global podcast consultancy. The executive producers on this episode, myself and Rachel Fountain. This episode was edited by Liam Riordan.